Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of Killing Time with Steven Sorensen. I am your host, Steven Sorensen. This is my talk show where I kill time by talking about topics which I find fascinating. So far, I've covered historical deception and different cases of when people were deceived, how and why and where they were deceived, and in this episode, I will be carrying on with a similar topic. I'm going to be providing some commentary on a book that I read called Faking, Forging, Counterfeiting: Discredited Practices at the Margins of Mimesis. This was published in 2018. It was authored by Daniel Becker, Annalisa Fisher, and Yola Schmitz. The link to this reading can be found in the description below. Before I begin, I just want to thank the Ctruth patrons for their continued support in my endeavor to make these videos and create the content that I do, so thank you for that. If you're not a patron and you want access to the rest of these videos, they are all on the Patreon, the Ctruth Patreon channel. The link to join that can be found in the description as well. So the first chapter in this book is called 6 Degrees of Separation: The Foe as More. It is authored by Professor Dr. Henry Kieser from Heidelberg University. The first part of the title, 6 Degrees of Separation, is taken from the 1990 stage play by John Guari that was a few years later made into a movie starring Will Smith. I personally haven't seen this play or the movie, but according to the author, Dr. Kieser, he says that it is related to forgery through the idea of a faked identity, where one of the main characters in this movie fakes his identity and fools two of the other main characters involved and convinces them that he is someone who he isn't. And this is the term itself is taken from this title, or this idea that all people are 6 or fewer social connections away from each other. The Wikipedia claims that the idea behind the term 6 degrees of separation is that you and I know each other through less than 7 people, and that I know a guy that knows a guy who knows you, and you know a guy that knows a guy that knows me, and so on and so forth. The author of this article, though, however, expands it beyond just social connections, knowing through people, and he says, according to this theory, anyone or anything on the planet can be connected to any other person or thing through a chain of acquaintances that has no more than 5 intermediaries. And this is, if it's made so that the terms are a lot more loose and it's just through acquaintances, and an acquaintance is something that perhaps you're familiar with or you know. Really, every single person on this planet could be connected through the fact that we're all on this planet, and that's just, it would only take one intermediary. But if you were to make the definition a little bit tighter about what would constitute an acquaintance, then that would change things. But so it's basically just talking about the things in between things. So how many different degrees of separation is there between you and me? Right now, I'm talking to you directly, but it's a video recording, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to talk back to me. If you're sitting in your house or in your car or wherever you're listening to this at and you're talking back to the video, I cannot hear you. I'm sorry. But back to this idea, it was invented in 1929, so just about 90 years ago. It was largely popularized by Guari's play, though. The population is now about 4 times larger than it was in 1929, but depending on how you define 6 degrees of separation, I think that it still holds some truth. When I was reading about it, there were people that were saying, it's never been substantiated, and I would assume that that would be on some of the more strict definitions as to what 6 degrees of what would constitute a degree of separation. So the author of this chapter, he highlights 6 degrees of separation from the original to the fake or the forgery. So I'm going to go through some of these and talk about the different ideas behind these different words here. So before I do that, there is a comment in the paper or the book that talks about Colette Lowell, who organized an exhibition called Intent to Deceive in 2011. And Lowell makes the distinction between a fake and a forgery, which is why on the list here it's the fake or the forgery, where a fake is a work that is modeled after an already existing work. So if you had the Mona Lisa and you created another Mona Lisa that was identical to the first one, that's what would be considered a fake. But if it's a forgery, it would be something that's modeled after a already existing piece of work. So the Mona Lisa, say, and it would be creating it to pass it off as if you were to edit it and change some stuff around a little bit and it was kind of the same and you tried to pass it off as being created by the same artist, then that would be considered a forgery. So it's something that is fake, but it's not identical to something that already exists. It's made in such a way that it's trying to be passed off as something which it's not. And so Lowell makes that distinction. There's also in the news recently so I think I talked about this on one of the previous episodes, but there's a consensus among scholars, or a growing consensus, a growing popularity in the idea that the post-2002 Dead Sea Scrolls, the ones that appeared on the market after 2002, the majority of those are forgeries. And in the news recently, there was a story about a museum. It was determined that all of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they had in their possession that dated after 2002 on the market, they were all determined to be forgeries. And the person that's referenced in the article that I was reading is Lowell, spelled the same exact way as this person here. So I wonder if it's the same person that organized the exhibition called Intent to Deceive. So yeah, with these definitions, I took some from Merriam-Webster and the Oxford Dictionary, and then also I have notes on what the author of this chapter himself had to say about them. So to start with, we have the original, and this is all about faking and forging. So the original is as close to the first product as you can get. And some of the definitions that I enjoyed was or that I thought was applicable here would be the number 1, of, relating to, or constituting an origin or beginning. So it would be the first of a style or a genre. The second definition, the first 2A, is not secondary, derivative, or imitative. So it's not something that's derived from another thing. Or 2B, which is being the first instance or source from which a copy, reproduction, or translation is or can be made. And the third is independent and creative in thought or action. And so these are all definitions of what would constitute an original. It's not something that is based on another thing. The author, and I quote, says, "The original, or the prototype, which can be replicated." So it's the first of a thing which then can be used to create replications or other types of things that are based off of that. So with that, we go on to the second one, the replica, which is an exact reproduction executed by the original artist, which is the first definition that I have here. Or 2, a copy exact in all details. And as I was looking through some of these words, the synonyms or the words that they use in the definitions are the same as the next word. So here on replica, for the second definition, it says a copy exact in all details, which copy is the third degree that we have on this 6th degree ladder here. And also the word replicated used by the author, that is the replicate or replica, is the 2nd degree. So there we have the original, the replica, and the copy. They're all very close, except for the fact that the original is that which the replica and the copy are based upon. And so a copy is an imitation, transcript, or reproduction of an original work. And the author has this to say about the copy. If the artist redoing the work is not identical with the original author, we have the case of the copy. And so the replica, in this sense, is executed by the original artist. And so if you were to draw a landscape painting and then you were to create an exact copy of that, it would be considered a replica. Where if somebody else were to create an exact copy of it, it would just be a copy. The 4th degree that we have here is the pastiche. And a pastiche is a literary, artistic, musical, or architectural work that imitates the style of previous work. And then the synonym for that is stylistic imitation, and that is the next degree that we have on here. The author has this to say about the pastiche. It's where individual elements from several works of an artist are assembled by another artist into a new composition. And so it would be like doing a Starry Night painting and changing it, though, so it's a completely new composition, but it is including elements from the other artist. And you could maybe do a Starry Night with a scream in it or something, and that would, I think, be considered a pastiche. So on to the 5th degree of separation, it's the stylistic imitation. And I couldn't find any definitions on Merriam-Webster or in the Oxford English Dictionary for this, but the author says, or maybe this is I found it on thoughtco.com in their English grammar section, this definition here. It's sentence imitation. Oh, so it's not even stylistic imitation, it's sentence imitation. It's an exercise in which students study a sample sentence and then imitate its structures, supplying their own material, which is kind of similar to stylistic imitation, but just limited to sentences. So it's where a student would study a sample of a piece of art, or it can also be literary, really any sort of creation that you would study and then copy it and use your own material in it. So it would be like maybe doing the Starry Night, but creating your own type of Starry Night just based off of that type of style, or that wave picture that has been redone hundreds of times. So the author says this about the imitation. Here, an artist does not refer with such precise and identifiable quotes from another artist's work as in the case of the pasticcio, but the resulting artwork instead stylistically points to a distinctive manner of an individual artist or an era. And so, yeah, it's not taking exact words or images from somebody else's work, but creating new ones in the same style as the old ones. So here we have the definition for fake and for forgery, and I found some of the definitions for forgery kind of funny, and but yeah, so for the fake I have not true, real, or genuine. and one that is not what it purports to be. The first two nouns that are relevant here. So the other definitions I didn't include because they weren't super relevant to this discussion. So not true, real, or genuine, which makes the distinction from the stylistic imitation. Really, it goes past these other 4 degrees into a realm of deception, where it's trying to deceive you into believing that it's something which it is not. Where these others, they're considered to be exactly what they are: a replica or a copy or a pastiche or an imitation. Whereas the fake or the forgery is made with the intent to deceive. So these definitions that I have for forgery, the first one is from Merriam-Webster. It says archaic, and it links you to the page for invention. The second definition that they have is something forged. The third definition that they have is an act of forging, which is, I'd always heard, or I heard often that it's not wise to define a word with the word itself, which is basically, if you're trying to define a forgery and you define it as something forged, obviously that's what a forgery is. But what does it mean to forge something? And so I think that would have been good to include on their website there. But their third definition, it says especially the crime of falsely and fraudulently making or altering a document, such as a check, which is, I gotta give them some credit. Yes, that is technically a forgery, but it's also much more than just fraudulently making or altering a document. You could do this with different types of architectural discoveries or marble statues. Really, anything that you can create can be forged and made to appear as something which it's not. So dictionary.com also had some better definitions here. The first one that they have is the crime of falsely making or altering a writing, which is definitely what I would consider a forgery. So it would be falsely making what it just said. But the Russians did this during World War II for sure. And I would imagine some other massive companies were also doing this act of forging to discredit their opponents and to try and get a leg up in the war. The second definition that dictionary.com has is the production of spurious work that is claimed to be genuine, as a coin, a painting, or the like. And so this is expanding the definition into spurious being something that is sketchy. It's expanding the number of things that can be forged onto coins and paintings. There's one coin forger who forged like hundreds of coins and did a fantastic job at it. Forging paintings has been an incredibly lucrative business for the people that can do it successfully and pass them off as real. The third definition is something as a coin, a work of art, or a writing produced by forgery, which is basically the second definition, just reversed. The fourth definition is an act of producing something forged, and the fifth definition says archaic, invention, or artifice. So yeah, basically 2 through 5 are they're based on an original, and they're made with the intent that you know that they're based on the original, and they're not trying to deceive you into believing something else rather than what is true. And so in between the original and the fake or the forgery is really just the defining line or characteristic is that the first 5 are all made without the intent to deceive, and that last one is made to deceive you. I gotta grab a sip of water here real quick. So then the author goes in to talk about some forgers of our times, and he mentions the German forger Wolfgang Baltracci, who in the 1980s forged hundreds of paintings worth millions of euros. And the author points out that his forgeries were not copies but stylistic imitations, and that Baltracci, he prided himself on never having made a copy. So all of his forgeries, his paintings that he made, they were made in the style of other artists, but not anything that other artist had ever done. And so he prided himself in not ever copying anyone. And I think last I checked, he's still alive today. So, yeah, that's interesting. He successfully forged hundreds of paintings before he was convicted for it. So there's other forgeries that were mentioned. A tiara of, I'm not even sure how to say it. I tried looking it up, but I couldn't find it. So it was an ancient crown made towards the end of the 19th century by a Jewish goldsmith, Israel Dovber Ruchomolsky. And he had so what this guy had done, he had created a pure stylistic imitation with no intent to deceive. But the people that he had sold it to, the merchants, they passed it off as an original without his knowledge. And so here we have a case of where prior with the painting forger, he did this with the intent to deceive people. He sold paintings with full well knowing that they weren't what he was selling them as. But this other guy, he sold this crown, this ancient crown, he sold it with the intent of telling people this is something that he made and that it wasn't an actually ancient crown. But then the people that he sold it to, they took it and tried to pass it off as something it wasn't. So this is where a stylistic imitation, the line blurs because it was originally made without the intent to deceive, but then sold under under deception. Also, for the guy that is mentioned, when I tried to find more information on him, the name was spelled differently. So, like every source that I found, the name was spelled differently. So I don't know why that was, but maybe there's a typo in the book, or there's multiple spellings for this guy's name. So yeah, to continue on, he brings up the painter and restorer Joseph van der Weken, who died in 1964. He was a Belgian art restorer, copyist, and art forger who mastered the reproduction of early Netherlandish painters. And from the very brief amount that I read about him, I think his forgeries went unquestioned until after his death. So sometimes people, they forge things and it is discovered within their lifetime that they're forgers, and they can be charged for it or dealt with accordingly. And other times, these people, their forgeries continue to deceive beyond their death. And so, yeah, until you can identify these forgeries, then they are still considered to be real. And the person that knew they were a forgery can't ever come out to say that they're fake. So the next forgers that are mentioned are the British duo John Drew and John Myatt, who I briefly talked about on the last episode. But here's what this author has to say, and I quote: John Drew smuggled forged documents into museum and gallery archives in order to give forgeries executed at his request by the painter John Myatt a credible history and provenance. And this is a quote that is talking about forging provenance for items. So while Mayat was out forging paintings, his partner in crime, Drew, was at the museums and the galleries and the archives and forging provenance to show that the paintings were there longer than they had been. So before a painting was even inserted into the gallery, there would be an apparent record that that painting had been there for some time, and therefore giving it more credibility to the fact that it's not a fake forgery that was just painted last week, but one that's been there for some time. And I could kind of see like a comedic scene going down where, you know, the museum curator is going over some of the inventory, and he sees a painting which he's not familiar with, and he's like, I don't remember seeing this here last week. And then Drew is like, oh, well, yeah, look, here in the archive, it says it's been here for 2 years. And the curator's like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. No, everything's fine. And it just goes about his business. And yeah, so that would be kind of funny, but also it's quite damaging to have to be dealing with these. And I think I might talk about that more later, but to continue, I have these quotes on these videos. A lot of these are posted on the Ctruth Instagram page, which I think you can find at Ctruth today. And so yeah, these I pull from articles and I post there just to kind of get some of the information out, but then I also use them here. So this quote, it reads, "Some forgeries are made and used with the clever intention to have them unmasked sooner rather than later as a means to test the awareness of a group of experts or society. Others are made with the clear objective to deceive experts and society as long as possible, ideally forever." And so this gets covered, I think, later in this chapter, but there's a distinction that is made by some to identify the forgeries which are made with the intent to uncover them at some point. Those are, I think, technically considered to be hoaxes. And so a hoax is it's a fakery that is meant to be uncovered in order to show the incompetence of a group of people, or to make it easier to ridicule them, or to possibly show a weakness in their methodology as to ascertaining the truth about certain topics. So the forgery, though, as distinguished from the hoax, would be considered something which is meant to never be revealed as a fake, and attempts to go unnoticed for as long as possible. And so in a sense, the forgery that is meant to go, the best type of forgery is that which goes unnoticed forever. So those forgeries which are out there right now, which have yet to be discovered, and there are forgeries out there yet to be discovered, those are right now, those are the best forgeries yet, because people don't yet know that they're forgeries, and therefore they're doing exactly what they were created to do, which is to fool people and to be passed off as something which they are not. So that leads into part 2 of this article, the foe as more. The title, the second part, so the first part was based on 6 degrees of separation. The second part of the title is based on an exhibition review from 1973 by the art critic Cheryl Bernstein. The title was "The Fake as More." And this, right after this, I think he does go in to describe the difference between the forgery and the hoax. And that is what I just described, where a forgery is meant to deceive as long as possible without any intention to uncover it as for what it is, while the hoax is intended to expose. There's an intent to expose the deception. The author goes into what a hoax is, or a faux, but I'm going to cover that after the history behind the title itself. So Bernstein's article, "The Fake is More." Um, maybe I guess I don't have more notes on that, but I couldn't tell if it was. I think it's a defense of the fake, where it's not, where fakes aren't something to be disgusted with, but rather something which are quite impressive if executed properly. So there's a article in 2013 by Jonathan Keats, and it's called "Forged: Why Fakes Are the Great Art of Our Age." And I think the author criticizes him here by saying that, as provocative as Keats's title might sound, the author actually falls short of the thus raised expectations, since where he talks about fakes, he merely rehashes the already well-known biographies of 6 forgers. The author also calls the forgeries by 2 of these people corny, and that they wouldn't really be considered great art, as the title would suggest. And so there's quite a bit of discussion within these circles that talk about fakes and forgeries as to what even constitutes a forgery and a fake, and what would make one great. And so the title of Keats's book, "Forged: Why Fakes Are the Great Art of Our Age," even from what I've seen, it does seem to be a poorly fitting title, but the goal behind it, I think, probably worked, because it is provocative, and that definitely helps with selling a book. So in this book, he goes in and talks about 6 forgers who, from what I can tell, were all active in the 20th century, and their names are Lothar Malscott, Alceo Docena. So Lothar Malscott, Alceo Docena, Han van Meegeren, Elmir de Hory, Eric Hebern, and Tom Keating. The first guy, Lothar Malscott, he pulled off a forgery in 1951 when his firm was commissioned to restore frescoes in the Cathedral of Marienkirche in Lubeck. The frescoes were practically destroyed when Malscott was hired to restore them, and he took the opportunity to create his forgeries and to try to pass them off as the real deal. He was successful, and the artists were praised for their works. It was a huge event, and even the West German government printed 2 million postage stamps depicting the forged frescoes. That was in 1951. In 1952, Malscott claimed to have forged the frescoes, and people didn't believe him. The trial took place 2 years later in 1954, and he was sentenced for 18 months, convicted guilty, and the frescoes were washed off the church walls. One report says that the cost of his forgeries in today's money would be over 15 million euros, which is a massive amount of money. In the US dollars, it would be $16.7 million, which is an incredibly massive amount of money. And so he seized upon this opportunity to exercise his skills and successfully pulled off a forgery, but he went and exposed it a year later, which this tends to happen sometimes. A forger will come forth and say that he forged something, and the public will not believe him because of how incredible the artwork was or how it had impacted their lives. And so 2 years later, he goes to court for it and eventually gets found guilty of of doing the forgery. So the next person is Alceo Docena, who was a stonemason and sculptor skilled at duplicating classical, Greek, Roman, medieval, and Renaissance styles. One of his dealers sold them to museums and collectors as authentic antiques. He caught on to his dealer doing this in 1928 and sued them. He received $66,000 in compensation, even though one of his forgeries sold for $150,000. And despite all this, his exhibits did extremely poorly, and he died very poor. But this is another example of an artist who is creating copies or replicas or stylistic imitations. They're creating works that are based on an original, and they're selling it while with the intent of telling people that it's not an original, it's not a true antique. And then the dealers, they capitalize on this artist's skill, and the naive connoisseurs or the people buying in the market to sell these replicas or copies off as antique artifacts. And so far on these are the 6 people from the book that they talk about forgery. The first guy, Mal Scott, he would technically, I think, be considered a hoaxer unless he had originally done it with the intent to deceive for as long as possible, and due to it, the weight on his conscience of pulling off this forgery, within the year or the next year, he cracked and had to come forward and confess to everything. And then the second guy, he wasn't a forger either. It was the marketers that then lied about it. So I wonder what you would even... I don't think that would be considered a forgery, as it wasn't the artist himself, but possibly. So far, 0 for 2, I think, for the definition on whether or not these people would be considered forgers. So Han van Meegeren had originally set out to show the incompetence of art critics and experts who had ridiculed the work he had presented under his own name. But due to the money he was making off of his forgeries, he decided not to expose them. And so this is an example of where he was originally doing this as a hoax. He then changed his mind because he was making so much money off of it to then have them be more properly identified as forgeries. And this is another, also kind of a good insight into a reason why somebody would want to forge items or create fakes for a hoax. He felt slighted by the art critics and experts who had ridiculed his own work. And I think it was this guy who wanted... Oh no, it's the next person. So yeah, but he went to go and ridicule these people that had slighted him, and then he was making so much money off of it that he decided not to expose it, and the hoax then turned into a forgery. Elmir de Hori. So yeah, this would, I guess, Meegeren might constitute as a forgery, since he then decided not to reveal them. So his hoax turns into a forgery. So that we'll cut the Keating, I think his name is. Yeah, Keats, Jonathan Keats. Cut him some credit. He's 1 in 3 so far on these 3 people. Elmer de Hori. After World War II, he started forging works by Picasso, Modigliani, and other famous artists. He was exposed in 1967. He claimed that one of his motivations was to unmask the incompetence of the experts, critics, and art dealers who had negatively judged his own works. And so I think that's why I got these 2 guys mixed up, because they kind of had a similar motivation for doing this. Is the experts, they critiqued their work in a negative way, and these guys wanted some revenge by showing that they didn't even know what they were talking about to begin with. And so they went and fooled these experts, which these 2 men successfully did. They did fool the experts. And additionally, this guy wanted to show how mediocre some of the artists really were. And so some of these famous artists, which are just amongst the most praised individuals in the art scene, Hori believed that they were mediocre to begin with, and weren't even deserving of the title of a great artist. So that, I don't know, I think was not considered a forgery under the definition that he was planning on unmasking them to show the incompetence of these people. And so that, I guess we're at 1 in 5 so far for the people listed there, for people that were actually forgers and went to try and deceive people as long as possible. So yeah, Tom Keating. This is definitely the best saved for last type situation here. He forged more than 2,000 paintings by about 100 different artists. That is 2,000 paintings by over 100 people. That is quite a task to do, for paintings too, if you think about how long some of these paintings take to make and come up with. But so yeah, he was exposed in 1976, and he was accused of fraud a year later. But the charges were dropped for at least two reasons: his poor state of health, and also because Keating had included marks on his forgeries which would prove their inauthenticity, making them hoaxes. And Dr. Keyser, he says that these are time bombs just waiting to go off. And so technically this would make Keating a hoaxer and not a forger by the more strict definition, and which would make the 6 forgers really like 5 hoaxers, like 4 hoaxers, 1 guy that got misrepresented, and a forger. So, and I quote, "With these time bombs, Keating speculated that sooner or later the traces would be detected, his forgeries would be unmasked, and thus the weaknesses of the art market would be put into evidence, which would be irritated and destablished." And he mentions how Keating was motivated by contempt for what he saw as a corrupt art market where American art critics and dealers exploited naive collectors and impoverished artists. And so all 3 of these last guys, they just kind of had it out for the critics and the art experts, and I think they had some good points for how we attribute value to a piece of work, or how we mark how much stuff is worth. And as I've been looking in through these forgeries, I've noticed that there's a lot of information out there, a lot of literature comparatively to literature on literary forgeries or other types of hoaxes. There's a lot of literature pertaining to the art forgeries. And I think that possibly this is due to the art forgeries being the biggest market for money. You could make, I think, more money with art forgeries than you could with literary forgeries. So I think that might be an explanation for that. But to continue, I just gotta take a sip of water here. To continue, Jonathan Keats, in his 2013 publication, he says, among the hoaxes cited by Keats, or this is what the author says about the publication. Among the hoaxes cited by Keats is an internet project by the Italo-American artist couple Franco and Eva Matz, who in 1998 created a fake website of the Vatican which copied and mimicked the appearance of the real site. And so this is a hoax of a website where this artist couple created a fake website of the Vatican that appeared to be the real deal to people that weren't paying attention. He goes on to say that they put out provocative content on the website, like quotes from pop songs, exaltation of free love, soft drugs, brother intolerance between religions, and the oblivion of the senses. Long story short, it caused quite a stir in the Catholic Church, and the church itself had to take action and made an official response to this website. So yeah, I found that to be kind of funny. The author's creation, he created this term faux. I think it's pronounced faux. So the title of his chapter is 6 Degrees of Separation, the Faux as More. And this is what he has to say about it. I have suggested calling the objects involved when hoax and fake blend in such a manner, foes or foxes, a mix of fake and hoax, which sounds like the French word for fake, faux. And so, I don't think it's folks or folkses, but the faux or foes. And I don't know if the author intended to make it sound closer to Poe, but if you don't know about this yet, there's an adage of internet culture called Poe's Law, and from the wiki article it says it's where when you don't have a clear indicator of the author's intent, it is impossible to create a parody of extreme views so obviously exaggerated that it cannot be mistaken by some readers for a sincere expression of the views being parodied. And the person it is named after, Nathan Poe, is quoted saying, "Without a winking smiley or other blatant display of humor, it is utterly impossible to parody a creationist in such a way that someone won't mistake for the genuine article." And so this is like, if you go onto the internet and you create a comment that is parodying another person or someone that you don't believe in and you mean to make it comical, there's no way for somebody to really distinguish, unless they know you personally, that that comment itself is meant to be taken in a as a parody and as a joke. And so in 1983, there's a similar statement by Jerry Schwartz, and he says, "Avoid sarcasm and facetious remarks. Without the voice inflection and body language of personal communication, these are easily misinterpreted. A sideways smile has become widely accepted on the net as an indication that I'm only kidding. If you submit a satiric item without this symbol, no matter how obvious the satire is to you, do not be surprised if people take it seriously." And I definitely agree with this guy when he talks about it being misinterpreted. I've definitely gone on the internet and posted comments that are supposed to be comedic, and people can't tell if I'm faking or not. And it's kind of funny. I think there's enough people on the internet now that understand that people go and do that, and so the people that know, they laugh, react the comments on Facebook, and they get a kick out of it because it's kind of funny to do. But then I feel like there's typically some person that he's not in on it, and he doesn't understand that it's not or they don't understand that it's not a serious comment. And so there's definitely something to taking out the personal language, the voice inflections, and the tone and body language, that it all plays into having a discussion with somebody and being able to tell if they're actually being serious about what they're saying or not. And then also, I guess this could backfire in such a way that when you do make a serious comment, people might assume that you're actually trying to make a parody, or you're joking, or you're not being serious. And so the textual literature is definitely harder to tell what the intent is. And I think that this could even be looked at in a historical light of trying to determine whether or not something that was written was meant to be taken seriously as a historical record, or if it is a parody made to make fun of another group of people. If you were to create an entire work, a historical work or something, and it was then later believed to be a true account, that could definitely impact our view of history if we don't understand what the original meaning behind a work was, and how to identify that. So I think the moral of the story here is just to not be too quick to react to things on the internet. Just conduct proper investigations into claims before generating strong convictions about them. So don't get too upset if you see something that you disagree with, because there's a chance that it's not even a legitimate post. So for the overall chapter, I think that he did a great job talking about some of the different examples of what a forgery is, or what constitutes a fake, and different ideas as to things that might be considered forgeries or fakes, but they're just copies. Really, the main thing here is that the fake and the forgery, they are made with the intent to deceive. And here I have a closing comment on the chapter. Fakes, forgeries, and foes come in all shapes and sizes. And that goes on. I talked about this in another video, one of the earlier episodes, but it was talking about these shops that would sell genuine antiques alongside with replicas, and how they were forging and creating so many fakes at such a rate that the fake ones outweighed the real ones by an extreme amount, and they were done in such a way that you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between the two. And so I think that, yeah, it's interesting. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they've been made for just about every single time period in history. If it's known about, then a fake or a forgery has been made for it. And so yeah, that's chapter 1 of this book. I found it to be an interesting read. The second chapter, I think I'll just get through the second chapter, and then that'll be it for this video. So the second chapter is titled Forgery, The Art of Deception. It's by Friedrich Teja Bach, and it's translated by Joel Scott. So in the spring 2012, it was then discovered that the New York copy of Sidereus Nuncius was a forgery, organized and carried out, like the forgery of other writings by Galileo, by the Italian Galileo scholar Massimo De Caro. As director of the famous Biblioteca de Girolami in Naples, he had been responsible for the embezzlement and counterfeiting of incunabula and valuable books on a grand scale. This is an interesting quote. It goes to highlight the people in positions of power, such as the director of this famous museum or library in Naples. And he reportedly had been responsible for the embezzlement and counterfeiting on a grand scale of incunabula and valuable books. And incunabula are printed books from the creation of the printing press to the year 1500. And so this is another reason to keep up your guard for people that are considered to be experts, or people that you are supposed to trust in their commentary on some of these things. They're in a position where it's possible for them to pull this off successfully and not get caught doing it, but the ones that do get caught, they are definitely models for the ones who haven't been caught on what not to do. So there is a quote. Oh, here, I do have this quote here. So yeah, and that was in 2012. And there's actually been quite a few people who have forged the works of Galileo, forging letters and works by famous scientific figures such as like Isaac Newton or Pascal, or really any major name in scientific history. There's been people who've tried to forge their documents. So I don't have a quote for this next one, I guess, but there's Paul Needham. He was the librarian for rare books and special collections at Princeton University. He says, consider, from the time that a serious problem with the authenticity of SNML, which is the forged Galileo document just mentioned above, from the time that a serious problem with its authenticity arose to the time of absolute determination that it was forged, only 3 weeks had passed. So he points out that from 2005 to 2012, an entire staff of experts pored over this book, and then once a serious suspicion was raised, it took just 3 weeks to establish that it was a forgery. So 2005 to 2012 is roughly 7 years. A whole team of experts was looking at this document, and none of them suspected it of being a forgery. And then as soon as somebody brought up the idea that maybe it was not what it purported to be, it took less than a month to figure it out. So that is an incredibly It's an incredibly short amount of time that it took for them to all determine that what they were looking at was indeed a forgery and not a genuine document from Galileo. So leading members of the investigatory team identified the reason for their failure as the evidence of authenticity seemed so unequivocal that none of the authors thought them questionable. All participants had used the method of negating the possibility of forgery instead of attempting to confirm the opposite. And so what I think that they're saying here is that they had used methods to negate the possibility of a forgery instead of using methods to try and determine that it was a forgery. And so after they had they thought that they had deleted every possible reason as to why it would be a forgery, that it was good and everything was chill and it was a legit document. But instead of trying to confirm it as a forgery, they missed out on the opportunity to not be misled. So next in this article, it brings up the Beltracchi spies affair, where in 2011, Werner Spies, one of the world's most renowned experts on Max Ernst, I think, was forging paintings along with Beltracchi, mentioned in the article prior. So beyond these, this is the next quote that I have from this article. It says, beyond these, competence in a specific, narrowly defined area needs to be complemented by an attention to the strategies of forgers as they come to light, because they set the precedents and serve as models for successors. And so this is, I think what this is saying is that as methods of forgery get discovered, newer forgers are going to capitalize on those methods, because I think it's easier to follow the style of someone else than to create your own style for some people. I think maybe possibly for more people it's that way, and for there's less trailblazers than there are followers. So these people that get exposed as forgers, they set the precedent for future forgers to then use the same methods. And if you're an expert in your field and you've spent no time at all looking into forgeries, then you're at higher risk to being deceived than somebody who's well aware of what's been forged and how and when and why, and what kind of methods we have to determine that. And it's kind of difficult in a sense, because forgers, they become aware, the successful ones at least, they become aware of the methods of verification used to determine an object as authentic. And so where the forger is coming at this creation of a forgery from the idea of, well, this is how they verify something, and so I'm going to create this in the sense that their verification will confirm it as authentic. The person who's trying to expose a forgery has to come up with ways of identifying forgeries and exposing these exploits of verification. And so I think to a degree it's easier for a forger to exploit verification processes to fool others than it is for others to identify a forgery, because the forgery itself is made in a way that it's trying to copy and imitate the original as closely as possible to the original. And so the best forgery is going to be that which is indistinguishable from an original. And so there's nothing that you could do to be able to show that one is the real deal and the other is not, because they're identical in every sense of the way. And the further away you fall from that identical standpoint, then that would constitute worse and worse forgeries. So the model forgery is that which is exactly identical. And there's this quote talking about forging provenance. For some time now, whole catalogs have been forged in order to prove that today's forgeries appeared in historical exhibitions of Russian avant-garde works that in fact never took place. And this is talking about Drew and Mayat, who became famous for forging the provenance of a work, and how there was a practice of creating whole catalogs forged in order to prove that a piece existed longer than it did. And so yeah, this is talking about art, but this has also been done in I think the Dead Sea Scrolls thing, where provenance was forged by the one sold by the Kando family. The post 2002 Dead Sea Scrolls had provenance forged. So I think I have one more quote from this chapter here. So Max Friedlander, museum curator and art historian, he has a famous quote that I've seen many times while reading in this. It reads, "It is indeed an error to collect a forgery, but it is a sin to stamp a genuine piece with the seal of falsehood." And I've thought about this for quite some time now too, as to what it even means. So to collect a forgery in error, believing that it's a real piece, that's an error. It's a mess up, it's not terrible, you could recover from it, but he highlights that to stamp a genuine piece with the seal of falsehood. So to say that the genuine Mona Lisa is actually a forgery of the real one, that is a sin. And so it's far more severe to say that a authentic object is a forgery than it is to say that a forgery is an authentic object. And that I can kind of agree with a little bit, but really it raises the discussion on what constitutes a forgery, and what kind of methods do we even have to be able to say this. And I think maybe even it goes to argue that taking a stance of agnosticism, where you don't know if it's a forgery or a real one, but you might be able to create an argument for why you would think that it's one thing or the other. But really, there's definitely a discussion on a case-to-case basis here as to what is a forgery and what is not. So sometimes on the Instagram account, the quotes that I use are chopped up a little bit. They still basically say the same thing that they say in the book, but they're chopped down. So like this one right here, this has more words than most of them do, and I try not to get too many words on the quote card there, but here I have the full quote, and so I'll read that one off to you, and you can see where it differs from the image on the screen here. So in his 1996 book False Impressions, Thomas Hoving estimates that in the decade during which he was director of the New York Metropolitan Museum, 1967 to 1977, questionable works and fakes made up a good 40% of the works that he investigated. He also assumes that at the time of the publication of his book, this portion had risen to 50%. And they estimate even higher levels for Russia and China and eBay. So in this decade that the curator, or the director of the New York Metropolitan Museum, a huge museum recognized across the world, he says that a good 40% of the works he investigated were questionable works and fakes. And so that's quite a bit. And then he says at the time of publication that the portion had risen to 50%. So basically the stuff that he was working with, it would be a 50-50 shot that what he was looking at was a legitimate work or a fake. And I just wonder if I want to talk to this guy and ask him more questions, but I want to see if if they put these fake pieces out on display knowing that they're fakes. There's quite a reason to be doing that when you create a forgery, or when somebody receives a forgery. It's not always in their best interest to then announce that they have accidentally bought a forgery to the public. It's better to keep these things under wraps, and I would imagine that there's definitely cases where there are famous pieces out on display that have been identified as forgeries by those in the know, and they still go on to continue to deceive other people. And it's not just a hunch that I have for this. This has been done in other instances, such as the Edward Stryka incident, where the people in the know knew that they were working with a fake person, but the audience was not let in on the secret until sometime later. So, just some closing comments on these first two chapters. Forgeries mess up a lot of art-related production, so exhibitions don't take place and new books don't happen because forgeries lower the price and the desire for people to look into this stuff, because a new exhibition, there's a higher chance that those things are going to be forged than something that's already been known about for hundreds of years. And so new books don't happen as well because, there's that fear that possibly what you'll be reporting on is a fake. But yeah, so forgeries, they do mess up quite a bit of stuff, but at the same time they have their purpose, and whether that be for better or for worse, I find it all really fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to check out the book if you have time to. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you want access to these other episodes that I've done so far, be sure to sign up on the Ctruth Patreon account. The link to that will be in the description. And I will talk to you next time. Goodbye.